The creek ran shallow that April morning, cutting through the limestone like God's own finger had traced it there. Elias Gray knelt by the water's edge, filling his canteen, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the Texas hill country, not the call of a mockingbird or the rustle of live oak leaves, but something broken and human. He found her 20 yards downstream, collapsed against a fallen cottonwood, her calico dress torn and muddied. Blood seeped through the fabric at her shoulder, dark and fresh. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that caught the morning light like copper wire. When Elias approached, her eyes snapped open, blue as winter sky and twice as cold. She scrambled backward against the log, one hand pressed to her wound, the other clutching at her skirt. "Stay back," she whispered, voice hoarse as sandpaper. "Just stay back." Elias stopped, hands raised peaceful-like. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers who'd seen too much, felt too much. Fear so deep it carved itself into a person's bones. "I'm not fixing to hurt you, miss," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're bleeding. Need that tended too?" She laughed then, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Hurt me?" Her gaze fixed on something past his shoulder, seeing things that weren't there. "Mister, if you got any kindness in you at all, you'll just kill me quick. Don't make it slow like—" Her words broke off, and she shuddered. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd heard talk in the war camps, whispers of things that happened to women caught in the wrong place when the world went mad, things that made decent men sick to think about. "Nobody's killing anybody," he said. "Let me look at that shoulder." "No." She pulled her knees up, making herself small. "You don't understand. You touch me, you'll see what they did. Then you'll know, and you'll want to finish what they started. Try me." Something in his tone must have reached her, because she went still. Elias had learned patience in the war, how to wait out enemy fire, how to sit quiet in a foxhole while shells whistled overhead. He used that patience now, crouched by the creek like a man waiting for fish to bite. Minutes passed. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the limestone bluffs. The creek murmured to itself, carrying last night's rain toward the Guadalupe River. Finally, she spoke. "My name's Maeve Tucker, Elias Gray." He touched the brim of his hat. "Pleased to know you, Miss Tucker." "Don't be." She winced as she shifted against the log. "Nothing pleasant about knowing me anymore." Elias studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the stubborn set of her jaw despite the fear in her eyes. "Let me see that wound. Maeve, I've got clean bandages in my saddlebags." For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, moving like it hurt more than the bullet wound, she let her hand fall away from her shoulder. The fabric was torn raggedly, probably snagged on thorns during her flight through the brush. Elias could see the furrow where a bullet had creased her, deep enough to bleed, but not life-threatening if kept clean. He moved careful-like, the way he'd approach a spooked horse. When he touched the torn calico to examine the wound, Maeve flinched but didn't pull away. "This'll heal clean," he said. "Bullet just kissed you. Lucky. Lucky." The word came out bitter. "That's me, all right. Lucky Maeve Tucker." As Elias worked, cleaning the wound with water from the creek, he noticed other things, old bruises fading yellow-green along her arms, a split lip that had healed crooked, and when the torn fabric shifted, revealing more of her left leg, he saw something that made his hands go still. On the pale skin of her inner thigh, burned deep and permanent, was a mark. Not an accident, not a scar from some mishap with a cook fire or branding iron gone astray. This was deliberate, precise, a word pressed into living flesh with heated metal, claiming ownership like you'd mark a steer. The word was property. Maeve saw where he was looking and jerked the fabric down, her face going white as creek foam. "Now you know," she whispered. "Now you see what I am." Elias sat back on his heels, his jaw working. In 4 years of war, he'd seen men do terrible things to each other, He'd thought he'd seen the worst of what humans could manage when they set their minds to cruelty. But this, marking a woman like livestock, this was something else entirely. "I see what they did to you," he said finally. "Not what you are." Tears came then, silent and steady. Maeve covered her face with both hands, shoulders shaking. "They had a whole place," she said through her fingers. "Called it a stockyard, but it wasn't for cattle. Women who couldn't pay their debts, or whose menfolk ran off and left them owing money, or who just got unlucky when the war came through. They took us there and..." She couldn't finish. Elias felt something hot and violent rise in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when Confederate artillery cut down his regiment at Shiloh. But this wasn't enemy soldiers he wanted to hurt. This was something worse. Men who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. "How'd you get out?" he asked. "Fire." Maeve lowered her hands, her eyes distant. "Place caught fire 2 weeks back. Guard who was supposed to be watching me was too busy saving his own skin. I ran." She looked down at her torn dress, her muddy feet. "Been running since..." "Well," Elias said, standing and offering her his hand. "You can stop running now." She stared at his outstretched palm like it might bite her. "You don't understand. Men like that, they don't let their property just walk away. They'll come looking. Let them look." Elias kept his hand steady. "They'll find me instead." For the first time since he'd found her, something shifted in Maeve's face. Not trust, that would take time, but maybe the faintest possibility of it. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold and thin, but her grip was firm. Elias helped her to her feet, steady as she swayed a little from the blood loss. "I got a cabin about 2 miles from here," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's got walls and a roof and a door that bars from the inside. You can rest there while that shoulder heals." "Why?" The question came out sharp. "Why would you help me? What do you want?" Elias thought about that as he whistled for his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Ruth who came picking her way through the brush. He thought about the empty cabin he'd built with his own hands after mustering out, about the long nights when the silence sat heavy as a stone on his chest. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said. "Maybe you are too." He helped Maeve up onto Ruth's back, then swung up behind her. She held herself stiff at first, every muscle tensed like she was ready to bolt, but as they rode through the morning shadows, following deer trails and creek beds toward his hidden valley, he felt some of that tension ease. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed by cedar and oak, built low and solid against the Texas wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning to check his traps. "It's not much," Elias said as he helped Maeve down from the horse. She stood in his dooryard, looking at the small vegetable garden, the split rail fence, the water barrel catching rain from the eaves. "It's peaceful," she said, and something in her voice made it sound like the finest compliment she could give. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A bed in the corner, a shelf for his few books, pegs on the wall for his rifle and coat. "You can have the bed," Elias said. "I'll make do with blankets by the fire." Maeve turned to look at him, and for the first time, her expression held something besides fear, confusion. Maybe, like kindness, was a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "I don't understand you," she said. "Nothing to understand." Elias stirred the coals in the fireplace, adding kindling until flames caught and danced. "You're hurt and scared and got nowhere else to go. I got space and food and time." Seemed simple enough, but as he watched her settle gingerly into one of his chairs, her hand unconsciously smoothing down her skirt to hide the brand on her thigh, Elias knew nothing about this was going to be simple at all. The first 3 days passed like a careful dance between 2 wounded animals. Elias moved through his routines, checking his snares, tending his small garden, mending harness leather, while Maeve sat by the window, watching him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with a price. She barely spoke those first mornings, just nodded when he offered her coffee or beans, shook her head when he asked if she needed anything. Her shoulder was healing clean, the angry red fading to pink. But Elias could see other wounds that ran deeper than flesh. On the fourth morning, he found her standing by the looking-glass he'd hung near the wash basin, a cracked mirror he'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead. She was staring at her reflection like she didn't recognize the face looking back. "Used to have longer hair," she said without turning around. It was the most words she'd spoken since telling him her name. Elias paused in the doorway, a bucket of fresh water in his hands. "Grows back. They cut it off first thing." Her fingers touched the ragged ends that barely reached her shoulders. "Said long hair was vanity, and vanity had to be beaten out of us." She turned from the mirror, and Elias saw something raw in her eyes. "You got scissors?" "I do. Why?" "Want to cut it proper, clean-like." She managed a ghost of a smile, tired of looking like something the cat dragged in. Elias set down the water bucket and fetched his shaving kit from the shelf. Inside was a small pair of scissors he used to trim his beard. "You sure about this?" Maeve nodded and settled into the chair by the fire. "Been thinking I might try to look like myself again. See if there's anything left worth looking at. Working careful as a barber." Elias trimmed her hair until it fell neat and even around her face. Auburn waves caught the firelight, bringing out the golden strands that had been dulled by dirt and neglect. When he finished, Maeve looked younger somehow. The sharp angles of her cheekbones softened. "Better?" she asked, touching the newly trimmed ends. "You look like a person again," Elias said, then immediately wished he could take the words back. "I mean, I know what you mean." Maeve stood and walked to the cracked mirror, studying her reflection. "They tried to make us forget we were people, made us answer to numbers instead of names, fed us slop like we were animals." She traced a finger along her jawline. "Some of the women, after a while, they started believing it, started thinking maybe that's all they really were." Elias gathered up the fallen hair, tossing it into the fire where it curled and vanished in the flames. "What kept you from believing it?" Maeve was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Anger. Pure, stubborn anger. Every time they tried to break me down, something inside me got madder. Figured if I was going to die, I'd die knowing I was still Maeve Tucker, not just some number branded on a list." That evening, as rain drummed against the cabin roof, Maeve surprised him by helping prepare supper. She moved around his small kitchen area with efficiency, cutting vegetables while he fried salt pork in his iron skillet. They worked without talking, but it was a different kind of silence than before, companionable rather than fearful. "You got any family?" she asked as they sat down to eat. "Had a brother, Daniel?" Elias pushed beans around on his plate. "Lost him at Fredericksburg. Pa died of fever the winter before I enlisted. Ma followed him 6 months later. Couldn't bear to be left behind, I reckon. I'm sorry. Long time ago now." He looked up at her. "What about you?" Maeve's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Had parents. Small farm outside Austin. Yankees came through in '63, took everything they could carry and burned the rest. Pa tried to stop them, so they shot him. Ma lasted through the winter, but the grief took her come spring. That when you ended up at that place?" "No." Maeve set down her fork, her appetite apparently gone. "Went to Austin, tried to find work, met a man who said he'd help me, give me a job at his business. Turned out his business was collecting women who had nowhere else to go." Her voice went flat. "By the time I figured out what kind of help he was offering, it was too late." The rain kept falling, drumming harder against the roof. Elias wanted to ask more, about how long she'd been trapped, about how many others there were, about the men who'd done this to her. But he could see the cost of what she'd already told him, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Tomorrow I'll ride into Bandera," he said instead. "Need supplies, medicine for that shoulder, maybe some cloth for a proper dress." Maeve's head snapped up. "You can't. Someone might recognize." "Nobody's going to recognize you. Your hair's different now, and you'll be wearing clean clothes. Besides, Bandera's 20 miles from here. Whoever's looking for you won't expect you to surface in a nothing town like that." You don't know these men." Fear crept back into her voice. "They got connections everywhere. People who owe them money. People who are scared of them. They put word out about runaway property, offer rewards. Then we'll be careful." Elias reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were still cold, always cold, like the fear had settled into her bones. "You can't hide in this cabin forever. Maeve, sooner or later, you got to step back into the world." She stared down at his hand covering hers. "Why are you doing this, really?" It was a fair question. Elias had been asking himself the same thing for 4 days now. He could have pointed her toward Austin, given her a few dollars and wished her luck. Could have minded his own business and gone back to his quiet life of hunting and trapping and trying to forget what he'd seen in the war. "Maybe because I know what it's like to feel like the world's got no place for you," he said finally. "After the war, when I came back here, everything looked the same but felt different. Like I was a ghost walking through my old life." He turned her hand over, studying the calluses on her palm, the thin white scars that spoke of hard work and harder times. "Maybe we both need to remember what it feels like to be alive again." Maeve's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hand away. "I don't know how to do that anymore. Be alive. I mean, feel things that aren't fear or anger or shame. We'll figure it out together." That night, Elias lay by the fire, listening to the rain and the soft sounds of Maeve's breathing from the bed across the room. Sometime in the small hours, he heard her cry out, not loud, just a small sound of distress that pulled him instantly awake. He found her sitting up in bed, staring at nothing, her body rigid with whatever nightmare had claimed her sleep. "Maeve?" He kept his voice low, gentle. "You all right?" She turned toward him, and in the dying firelight he could see the tears on her cheeks. "I dreamed I was back there, could smell the smoke, hear the screams." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Sometimes I think I'll never really get away. Part of me will always be in that place." Elias rose from his bedroll and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked darkness. "I used to dream about the war every night, saw Daniel getting shot over and over again, heard artillery in every thunderstorm." He turned back to her. "Dreams fade. If you give them time, the real world gets stronger than the nightmares. Eventually." "You believe that?" "I'm starting to." In the morning, the rain had stopped and sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, turning the wet world outside into something that sparkled and gleamed. Maeve stood at the door, breathing deep of the clean air. "Smells like growing things," she said. "Spring's coming on strong now." Elias joined her in the doorway. "Few more weeks. Wildflowers will be everywhere. Bluebonnets thick as carpet. I always loved spring." Something soft entered her voice. "Pa used to say spring was God's way of reminding folks that nothing stays broken forever. Smart man, your PA. He was." Maeve stepped out onto the small porch, lifting her face to the sun. Maybe we could go to Bandera today, if you still want to." Elias studied her profile, noting the determined set of her chin despite the lingering wariness in her eyes. "You sure?" "No." She turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her by the creek, she smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes and made her look like the young woman she should have been. "But I'm tired of being scared, tired of hiding. If I'm going to live in this world again, I reckon I better start somewhere." As they prepared for the ride to town, Elias watched Maeve braid her newly trimmed hair with careful fingers. She'd washed her face and hands in the basin, scrubbing away the last traces of dirt and fear. In his spare shirt and an old pair of pants cinched tight with rope, she looked small but determined. "Ready?" he asked, checking his rifle one more time before securing it to his saddle. Maeve nodded, though he could see her hands shake slightly as she adjusted the hat he'd given her. "Ready as I'll ever be." They rode out into the morning, leaving the safety of the hidden valley behind. But for the first time since finding her by the creek, Elias thought he glimpsed something in Maeve's face that wasn't fear or pain or desperate hope. It looked like courage. Bandera sat in a fold of limestone hills like a handful of buildings tossed by a careless giant. The main street was little more than packed dirt rutted by wagon wheels, bordered by a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other enterprises that served the scattered ranchers and farmers of the hill country. Elias felt Maeve tense behind him as they rode into town, her hands gripping his belt tight enough to leave marks. He'd given her his spare coat to wear over the borrowed clothes, and she'd pulled the hat low over her face, but he could feel her anxiety radiating like heat from a forge. "Easy," he murmured. "Just getting supplies and heading home." The general store smelled of leather and tobacco, pickled goods and kerosene. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, looked up from her ledger as they entered, her curious gaze taking in Maeve's borrowed clothes and nervous demeanor. "Morning, Elias," she said with the careful politeness of someone who knew better than to ask too many questions. "What can I help you with today?" "Need some medicine," Elias said, stepping slightly in front of Maeve. "Iodine and bandages, and maybe some cloth suitable for sewing." Mrs. Henderson gathered the requested items while stealing glances at Maeve, who stood silent and still near the door, like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. When the woman brought out several bolts of calico and cotton, Maeve surprised them both by stepping forward. "The blue one," she said quietly, touching a bolt of sky-colored cotton printed with tiny white flowers. "If that's all right." "Course it is," Mrs. Henderson said, her expression softening. "Pretty choice. Bring out your eyes." As Mrs. Henderson measured and cut the fabric, Elias bought coffee, flour, and other necessities. The normalcy of it, the everyday business of purchasing supplies, seemed to calm Maeve somewhat. She even ventured to look at some ribbons displayed near the counter, though she didn't ask for any. They were loading their purchases into Elias's saddlebags when trouble found them. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice came from behind them, rough with drink despite the early hour. Elias turned to see a man weaving slightly on his feet outside the saloon across the street. He was tall and thick-bodied, with greasy hair and clothes that spoke of too many nights sleeping rough. "Thought I recognized that walk." The drunk continued, his voice carrying clear across the street. "Come here, girl. Let me get a better look at you." Maeve went rigid beside him. Elias stepped between her and the approaching man, his hand resting casual-like on the butt of his pistol. "You got business with us, friend?" Elias asked. The drunk stopped a few feet away, swaying as he squinted at Maeve. "Might do. Depends on whether this little filly's got a particular mark on her that would make her worth a considerable sum to certain interested parties." "Don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't?" The drunk grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "See, there's been word put out about some missing merchandise. Valuable merchandise that walked away from its rightful owners. Folks offering good money for information about its whereabouts." By now, other people had started to notice the commotion. A few men emerged from the saloon, drawn by the raised voices. Mrs. Henderson stood in her store doorway, wringing her hands. Even the blacksmith had stopped his hammering to watch. "You're drunk," Elias said. "Go sleep it off." "Maybe so, but I got eyes." The man tried to peer around Elias at Maeve. "That one's got the look." "All right." Scared and skittish, trying to hide herself. "Why don't you lift that skirt and show us what's marked on that pretty leg of yours?" "Sweetheart." The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. Elias heard her sharp intake of breath, felt her take a step backward. When he glanced back at her, he saw all the progress they'd made, the small steps toward courage and hope, crumbling in her face. "That's enough," Elias said, his voice gone cold and flat, but the drunk was emboldened now by the growing audience. "Come on, darling, just a quick peek. Prove you're not what I think you are, and we can all go about our business. Course, if you are what I think." He licked his lips. "Well, there's men who pay handsomely for the return of runaway stock." The word stock hung in the air like poison. Around them, Elias could feel the mood of the crowd shifting. Some looked uncomfortable at the drunk's crude talk. but others were listening with the sharp attention of men who smelled profit. "Ah, last warning," Elias said. "Or what?" The drunk laughed. "You gonna shoot me over some used-up whore? Hell, boy, there's plenty more where—" Elias's fist caught him square in the jaw, dropping him like a sack of grain. The drunk hit the dirt hard, rolled once, and lay still. For a moment, the street was silent except for the distant sound of a dog barking. Then voices erupted all around them, some angry, some approving, all curious about what would happen next. "Come on," Elias said to Maeve, taking her arm. "We're leaving." But as they moved toward their horse, one of the men from the saloon called out, "Hold on there, that man might have been drunk. But what if he was right? What if she is escaped property? Then maybe there's reward money to be had," another voice added. Elias could feel the crowd's mood turning ugly. These were hard men living in hard times, and the promise of easy money was a powerful lure. He helped Maeve onto their horse, then swung up behind her, all the while keeping his hand near his gun. "Nobody needs to do anything foolish," he said, addressing the crowd. "We're just passing through." "Maybe you are," said the blacksmith, a barrel-chested man with arms like tree trunks. "But maybe we ought to send word to the authorities. Let them sort this out proper-like." "What authorities?" Elias asked. "Sheriff's been dead 6 months, and you know it." "Well then, maybe we handle it ourselves," the blacksmith said. "Way I see it, if this girl's stolen property, returning her is the right thing to do, Christian thing." Maeve made a small sound behind him, part whimper, part sob. Elias could feel her shaking against his back, could sense the fear threatening to swallow her whole again. "Look at her," he said, his voice carrying clear across the street. "Look at her real good. Does she look like property to you? Does she look like something to be bought and sold?" Some of the crowd shuffled uncomfortably, but the blacksmith stood his ground. "Looks don't matter. Law's the law, and theft is theft." "Whose law?" Elias's voice turned hard as winter iron. "Law that says a woman can be marked like cattle? Law that says human beings can be bought and sold like horses or hogs?" He looked around at the faces watching them. "That the kind of law you men want to uphold?" For a moment, the crowd wavered. Then an older man stepped forward, someone Elias recognized as a local rancher named Samuel Cross. "Now, Elias," Cross said in a reasonable tone, "we're not talking about right or wrong here. We're talking about returning lost property to its rightful owners. If this girl belongs to someone, if money's been invested in her, then taking her is stealing, plain and simple." "She belongs to herself," Elias said. "Same as you, same as me." That's a fine sentiment," Cross replied. "But it don't change the facts. Someone's offering money for her return, which means she's got value. Value that rightfully belongs to whoever paid for it." The drunk was starting to stir now, groaning and holding his jaw, when he saw Elias still mounted and ready to ride. His face twisted with rage. "Don't let them get away," he shouted. "That there's a marked woman. I'd stake my life on it. Someone check her leg. You'll see what they burned into her." The crowd pressed closer, and Elias knew they were moments away from violence. He could fight a few men, maybe, but not a whole town. And even if he could, what then? Word would spread. Other bounty hunters would come. Maeve would never be safe. "Step back," he said, drawing his pistol. "All of you." The sight of the gun sobered some of the crowd, but not all. The blacksmith hefted his hammer, and Cross had his hand on the rifle slung across his shoulder. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Son," Cross said, "we're reasonable men. We'll make sure she's treated fair while we sort this out." "Like hell you will." Elias backed their horse toward the edge of town, keeping his gun trained on the crowd. "I've seen how reasonable men treat women they think of as property." Behind him, Maeve whispered, "Elias, please, just leave me. Save yourself." "Not happening," he said without turning around. They'd almost reached the town limits when the drunk called out one last time. "Run all you want. Word's already spreading. Jonah Beeksley's got men everywhere, and they'll find you eventually. You can't hide stolen goods forever." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Jonah Beeksley. He'd heard that name whispered in army camps, always with disgust and fear. A man who'd found ways to profit from the war's chaos, who'd built an empire on other people's misery. As they rode hard away from Bandera, following deer trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks, Elias felt the weight of what they were up against settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about local bounty hunters or small-town greed. This was about a man with resources, connections, and the kind of ruthless determination that had made him rich off other people's suffering. Behind him, Maeve wept silently, her tears soaking through his shirt. The hope he'd seen building in her over the past days was gone, replaced by the old familiar despair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I brought this on you." "Nothing to be sorry for," Elias said, though his mind was already racing ahead, planning their next moves. They'd need supplies, weapons, a place to make a stand. Because one thing was certain now, Jonah Beaksley knew where to find them, and he wouldn't give up easily. As they rode deeper into the hill country, leaving the dust and judgment of Bandera behind, Elias made himself a promise. Whatever came next, however this ended, Maeve Tucker would never wear another man's brand again, even if it killed him to make sure of it. 3 days passed in uneasy quiet after their flight from Bandera. Elias kept watch from the cabin's single window, rifle always within reach, while Maeve barely spoke and hardly ate. The blue fabric they'd bought sat untouched on the table, a reminder of hopes that had been crushed under the weight of ugly reality. On the 4th morning, Elias made a decision that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Need to go back," he said, checking his pistol for the 3rd time that morning. Maeve looked up from where she sat mending his spare shirt. Busy work to keep her hands occupied. "Back where?" "Bandera. Need to know what we're dealing with. Who this Beaksley fellow really is. What kind of men he's got working for him." Elias holstered the gun and reached for his hat. "Information's the only advantage we got right now. It's too dangerous." Fear crept into her voice. "What if someone recognizes you? What if they're waiting? Then I'll find out about that too." He knelt beside her chair, taking her work-worn hands in his. "I can't protect you if I don't know what's coming." Maeve's fingers tightened around his. "What if you don't come back?" The question hung between them, heavy with all the things they hadn't said to each other. Elias studied her face, the sharp cheekbones, the blue eyes that held depths of pain no 19-year-old should carry. "I'll come back," he said. "That's a promise." The ride to Bandera felt longer this time. Every shadow potentially hiding enemies. Every bird call a possible signal. But the town seemed normal when he arrived, lazy and dust-covered in the afternoon heat, with only a few horses tied outside the saloon. Elias left his mount at the livery stable and walked casual-like toward the general store, ears tuned for any unusual talk. "Mrs." Henderson greeted him with nervous politeness, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble to follow him inside. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," she said. "Forgot to buy coffee." Elias lied, picking up a small bag from the shelf. As Mrs. Henderson counted his change, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Elias, I don't know what kind of trouble you and that girl are mixed up in, but there's been men asking questions, professional men, if you catch my meaning." "What kind of questions?" "About strangers passing through, about a particular young woman with auburn hair. Mrs." Henderson glanced toward the saloon. "One of them's in there now, talking to folks. Claims to be a lawman, but—" She shrugged. "Sheriff's badge can be bought same as anything else, I reckon." Elias thanked her and stepped back into the street, his mind working. A false lawman meant Beaksley had resources, connections. It also meant the man was smart enough to give his hunters a veneer of legitimacy. The saloon was dim and smoky, smelling of whiskey and unwashed bodies. A dozen men sat at various tables, nursing drinks and playing cards. At the bar stood a man who immediately drew Elias's attention, tall and well-dressed, with silver-gray hair and the kind of bearing that spoke of authority. The man wore a sheriff's star on his vest, but everything else about him was wrong. His clothes were too fine for a small-town lawman. his boots too expensive. When he turned to survey the room, Elias saw eyes like chips of winter ice, calculating and cold. This had to be Jonah Beaksley. Elias ordered whiskey and found a table where he could listen without being obvious about it. Beaksley was holding court at the bar, regaling the locals with stories that painted him as a defender of law and order. Terrible thing. The breakdown of civilization we've seen since the war, Beaksley was saying, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a practiced politician. Men taking what doesn't belong to them, women forgetting their proper place in society. Why, just last week I had to track down a young woman who'd been led astray by criminal elements. What kind of criminal elements? Asked one of the locals. The worst kind. Men who prey on the weak and vulnerable, who fill women's heads with dangerous ideas about freedom and independence. Beaksley's voice took on a tone of righteous indignation. This particular woman had been legally bound to work off her family's debts, but instead of honoring that obligation, she allowed herself to be seduced by promises of easy escape. Elias felt his jaw clench. The way Beaksley told it, Maeve was nothing more than a runaway debtor who'd been corrupted by outside influences. Folks around here seen this woman? Beaksley continued. Auburn hair, blue eyes, about 19 years old. She'd be traveling with a man, probably someone who doesn't understand the legal complexities of the situation. Matter of fact, said the drunk who'd confronted them days earlier, his jaw still swollen from Elias's punch. We did see someone matching that description, traveling with a fellow named Elias Gray. Beaksley's attention sharpened like a hawk spotting prey. Elias Gray, you say? Tell me about this man. As the drunk launched into a description of their encounter, Elias studied Beaksley's face. He saw calculation there, and something else, a cold satisfaction that made his skin crawl. This Gray, Beaksley said thoughtfully. Does he have property around here? Someplace he might take a fugitive to hide? Got a cabin somewhere up in the hills, offered another local. Keeps to himself mostly. War veteran, I think. Ah. Beaksley nodded as if this explained everything. Another poor soul damaged by the conflict, no doubt. The war left many men with confused ideas about authority and proper order. He turned to address the room at large. Gentlemen, I'm prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to the recovery of this stolen property. $50 for reliable intelligence, $200 for actual recovery. The numbers sent a ripple of excitement through the saloon. That kind of money could keep a man comfortable for months. Now, I want to be clear, Beaksley continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of a judge. This isn't about vengeance or cruelty. This is about upholding the law, about maintaining the contracts and obligations that hold civilized society together. The woman in question owes a legal debt, and that debt must be paid. What happens to her when you find her? Asked someone from the back of the room. Beaksley's smile was thin as a knife blade. She'll be returned to her rightful place, of course, and she'll complete her obligation as originally agreed. As for the man who aided her escape, he shrugged. Well, theft is theft, regardless of the thief's intentions. Elias had heard enough. He finished his whiskey and stood to leave, moving casual-like toward the door. But as he passed the bar, Beaksley's voice stopped him cold. You're new here. Elias turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral. Passing through, Beaksley studied him with those ice-chip eyes, taking in his worn clothes, his careful posture, the way his hand rested near his gun. You have the look of a soldier about you. Which side did you serve? Union, Elias said, seeing no point in lying. Ah, a fellow veteran. Beaksley's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then you understand the importance of duty, of following orders even when they're unpleasant. The war taught us both that civilization requires structure, doesn't it? Rules that must be followed. Debts that must be paid. Depends on the rules, Elias said carefully. Some orders aren't worth following. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Beaksley's smile faded, replaced by something much more dangerous. An interesting philosophy, he said softly. Tell me, friend, what's your name? for a heartbeat. Elias considered lying, but something in Beaksley's manner told him the man already knew the answer. "Elias Gray." A murmur ran through the saloon. Beaksley's expression didn't change, but Elias caught a flicker of satisfaction in those cold eyes. "Elias Gray," Beaksley repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. "The same Elias Gray who was seen in this very town 3 days ago, traveling with a young woman of particular interest to me? Don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't." Beaksley reached into his vest and pulled out a silver pocket watch, checking the time with elaborate casualness. "It's interesting. Mr. Gray, how often good intentions lead men astray? I imagine you thought you were helping this woman, didn't you? Thought you were rescuing her from some terrible fate." Elias said nothing, but his hand drifted closer to his gun. "The truth is more complex, I'm afraid." Beaksley continued. "The young woman you're harboring is legally bound property, purchased and paid for according to proper contracts. By hiding her, you're committing theft. By refusing to return her, you're compounding that crime. Funny kind of law that lets men own women like livestock," Elias said. "The law's the law, regardless of our personal feelings about it." Beaksley's voice carried the patient tone of a teacher addressing a slow student. "But I'm a reasonable man. Mr. Gray, return what you've taken, and we can forget this unfortunate misunderstanding ever happened." "And if I don't," Beaksley's smile returned, colder than before, "then I'm afraid I'll have to exercise my authority as a duly appointed peace officer. You see, theft of valuable property is a serious crime, punishable by imprisonment or worse." Around them, the saloon had gone dead quiet. Every man in the room was listening, waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. "That tin star on your chest," Elias said, keeping his voice level. "Where exactly did you get it?" "I am a legally appointed sheriff, Mr. Gray, with full authority to enforce the law in this territory." "Which territory would that be?" For the first time, Beaksley's composure cracked slightly. "I think we're done here. Mr. Gray, you have 24 hours to consider my generous offer. After that," he shrugged. "Well, after that, I'll be forced to take more direct action." Elias backed toward the door, never taking his eyes off Beaksley. "You know where to find me?" "Indeed I do." Beaksley turned back to the bar, dismissing him with studied casualness. "Indeed I do." As Elias stepped into the afternoon sunlight, he heard Beaksley's voice resume behind him, now addressing the room in general. "Gentlemen, you've just witnessed the kind of lawlessness that threatens to tear our society apart. A man who places his personal feelings above legal obligation, who thinks himself above the contracts and debts that bind us all together." Elias didn't wait to hear more. He retrieved his horse and rode hard toward home, his mind racing with everything he'd learned. Beaksley wasn't just a bounty hunter or a corrupt lawman. He was something worse. A man who'd found a way to make slavery legal again, who'd built a system of debt and bondage that trapped the desperate and vulnerable. And now that system had found them. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Elias knew their time of hiding was over. Beaksley would come, and when he did, it would be with the full weight of corrupted law behind him. The only question now was whether they'd be ready. Elias arrived at the cabin just as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. His horse was lathered with sweat from the hard ride, and his own shirt was soaked through. As he dismounted, Maeve appeared in the doorway, her face pale with worry. "What did you learn?" she asked, helping him with the saddle. "More than I wanted to." Elias led the horse to the small corral behind the cabin. "Beaksley's in Bandera. Claims to be a sheriff, but that badge is as false as everything else about him." Maeve's hand stilled on the saddle blanket. "You saw him?" "Talk to him. He knows we're here, knows about the cabin." Elias turned to face her, seeing his own grim certainty reflected in her eyes. "He's giving us 24 hours to surrender you voluntarily. Then that's what we'll do." Maeve's voice was steady, but Elias could see the terror lurking beneath her calm facade. "I won't have your death on my conscience," Nobody's surrendering anybody. Elias took the saddle blanket from her hands and hung it on the fence rail. We knew this day would come. Now we figure out how to face it. They spent the evening preparing for war. Elias cleaned his rifle and pistol, counted ammunition, checked the locks on doors and shutters. Maeve helped where she could, melting lead to cast bullets, preparing bandages from the blue cloth they'd bought in town. "How many men do you think he'll bring?" she asked as they worked by lamplight. "Hard to say. 3 or 4, maybe more. Depends on how much he wants you back." Elias loaded shells into his rifle. The metallic clicks loud in the quiet cabin. "Question is whether they'll try to take you alive or just settle for making an example." Maeve was quiet for a long moment, her hands busy tearing cloth into strips. "At that place," she said finally, "when women tried to run and got caught, they'd bring them back to the yard and make all the others watch while they punished them." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They said it was to discourage rebellion, but I think Beaksley just enjoyed it." Elias felt a cold rage settle in his chest. "He won't lay a hand on you again. That's a promise. You can't promise that. You're just one man against however many he brings." "Maybe so, but I'm one man who's got something worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Maeve looked up from her work, meeting his eyes across the table. "Elias," she began, but whatever she was going to say was cut off by the sound of horses approaching through the darkness. Both of them froze, listening. The hoofbeats were still distant but growing closer, coming from the direction of the main trail. "Too early," Elias muttered, blowing out the lamp and moving to the window. "Said 24 hours. Through the darkness, he could make out 3 riders picking their way carefully up the rocky path to the cabin. They moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going. "Back room," Elias whispered to Maeve. "Bar the door and don't come out no matter what you hear. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. You are if you want me to have a chance." He pressed his spare pistol into her hands. "If they get past me, use this. Don't let them take you alive." Maeve's fingers closed around the gun, and for a moment her mask of control slipped, showing the frightened girl beneath. "If you don't come back, I will." Elias kissed her forehead, quick and gentle. "I will." The riders had stopped just outside the circle of light from the cabin windows. Elias could hear them talking in low voices, probably planning their approach. He positioned himself behind the overturned table, rifle ready, and waited. "Elias Gray." The voice that called out wasn't Beaksley's, but it carried the same arrogant authority. "We know you're in there. Come out and we can discuss this like civilized men." Elias said nothing, watching the shadows beyond the windows. These weren't Beaksley's men. The voice was wrong. Too young and too eager. Hired guns, most likely, looking to earn that $200 reward. "Gray, we're not here to hurt anybody. Just want to talk." A lie. Of course, if they'd wanted to talk, they would have come in daylight. Night raids were for killing and taking. One of the shadows moved closer to the front window, trying to peer inside. Elias tracked him with the rifle, finger on the trigger, waiting for the right moment. "Maybe he ain't here," said another voice. "Maybe they already run off." "Horse is still in the corral," replied the first speaker. "He's here all right. Probably got that runaway with him too. So what's the plan? Wade, we going in?" "Wade." Elias filed the name away as he watched the man creep closer to the door. Young voice, young movements. Probably some local boy thinking to make his fortune hunting people. "Beaksley wants them alive if possible," Wade said. "But if they resist..." The rest was lost as the 3 men spread out around the cabin. Elias heard footsteps on the roof, someone climbing up to try the chimney or maybe just get a better view inside. Another set of boots moved around toward the back door. They were surrounding him, cutting off escape routes. The attack came without warning. A window exploded inward as someone threw a rock wrapped in cloth, followed immediately by a burning brand that set the curtains ablaze. At the same time, boots kicked at both the front and back doors. Elias fired through the front door, heard a curse and a thud as someone fell. The back door held for a moment, then burst open to reveal a stocky man with a shotgun. Elias rolled sideways as the shotgun boomed, buckshot splintering the wall where he'd been crouched. He came up firing, his bullet catching the shotgunner in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man stumbled backward but didn't go down, still trying to reload his weapon. From the roof came the sound of someone dropping down the chimney, followed by cursing as they hit the banked coals in the fireplace. Smoke and the smell of burning hair filled the cabin. Elias scrambled toward the bedroom door, desperate to put himself between the attackers and Maeve. As he moved, Wade appeared in the broken window, pistol in hand. "There he is!" The shot took Elias in the side, spinning him around and slamming him against the cabin wall. Pain flared white-hot through his ribs, but he managed to get off a return shot that sent Wade diving for cover. More gunfire erupted as the man from the chimney emerged from the fireplace, clothes smoldering, face black with soot. He had a rifle and was looking for targets in the smoke-filled cabin. Elias tried to reach his fallen weapon, but another bullet clipped his shoulder, sending him sprawling. Blood ran hot down his arm, and his vision wavered as shock tried to claim him. The shooting stopped suddenly, leaving only the crackle of flames and the ringing in Elias's ears. Through the smoke, he saw Wade standing over him, pistol trained on his chest. "Well, well," Wade said, breathing hard. "The famous Elias Gray. Doesn't look like much, does he, boys?" The other two attackers appeared through the haze, the shotgunner holding his wounded shoulder, and the soot-covered man from the fireplace. All three looked worse for wear, but they were standing while Elias lay bleeding on the floor. "Where's the girl?" Wade demanded. Elias said nothing, conserving his strength. The bedroom door was still closed, still barred from inside. Maybe Maeve would have the sense to slip out the window and run. "I asked you a question." Wade's boot connected with Elias's wounded side, sending fresh waves of agony through his body. "Go to hell," Elias gasped. Wade laughed. "Tough talk from a man who's bleeding out on his own floor." He gestured to his companions. "Search the place. She's got to be here somewhere." As the two men moved toward the bedroom, Elias heard the bar being lifted from inside the door. "No," he thought desperately. "Stay hidden. Run!" But the door opened, and Maeve stepped out, the pistol held steady in both hands. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. Wade turned toward her, grinning. "There she is, the famous runaway. You led us quite a chase, darling." I said, "Leave him alone." Maeve kept the gun trained on Wade's chest. "You want me? Here I am. Take me and go." "Oh, we'll take you all right. But first we got to deal with your friend here. Can't have word getting around that folks can steal from Mr. Beaksley and live to tell about it." Elias tried to push himself up, tried to reach for a weapon, anything to help her, but his strength was flowing out with his blood, leaving him weak as a newborn. "Please," Maeve said, and now her composure was cracking. "He was just trying to help me. This isn't his fight." "Sure it is," Wade said. "Became his fight the moment he decided to steal Beaksley's property." He raised his pistol toward Elias's head. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll make it quick." The shot that followed wasn't from Wade's gun. Maeve's bullet took him high in the chest, the impact lifting him off his feet and slamming him backward into the cabin wall. He hit hard and slid down, leaving a dark smear on the wood. For a moment, the cabin was absolutely silent. Then the other two men erupted into motion, the shotgunner trying to bring his weapon to bear while the soot-covered man fumbled for his rifle. Maeve fired again, missed, and dove sideways as buckshot chewed splinters from the door frame where she'd been standing. Elias summoned the last of his strength and lunged for Wade's fallen pistol, managing to get his hands on it just as the rifleman took aim at Maeve. Elias's shot caught the man's center mass, dropping him instantly. The shotgunner, seeing both his partners down, broke for the door. Maeve let him go, running instead to where Elias lay gasping against the wall. "How bad?" she asked, her hands already working to examine his wounds. Bad enough, Elias admitted. The world was going gray around the edges, and he could taste blood in his mouth. But I'll live. Question is, what do we do now? Outside, they could hear the survivor riding hard toward town, no doubt carrying word of the failed raid to Beaksley. Soon there would be more men, better prepared and twice as angry. We run, Maeve said, helping him to his feet. We patch you up and we run as far and as fast as we can. Elias leaned heavily on her, fighting waves of dizziness. Can't run forever. Then we run until we can't run anymore. Maeve's voice was fierce with determination. But we don't give up. We don't let them win. As she helped him toward the door, stepping over the bodies of the men who'd come to kill them, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced since the war, a kind of grim pride in having faced impossible odds and survived. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Beaksley would come himself next time, and he'd bring enough men to finish the job properly. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, they were alive. They were together. And they were free. For now, that was enough. They didn't make it far. Elias lasted maybe 2 miles before the blood loss and shock caught up with him. He slumped forward in the saddle, and only Maeve's quick reflexes kept him from tumbling to the ground. She managed to guide their horse to a sheltered spot among the live oaks, where a spring bubbled up from limestone rocks. Can't go much further, Elias mumbled, his face gray as old ashes. Maeve helped him down from the horse, her heart hammering as she felt how much blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages. The bullet wound in his side had reopened during the ride, and his shoulder was still seeping steadily. We have to keep moving, she said, though she could see he was in no condition to travel. That man who got away, he'll bring Beaksley and more guns. Know that. Elias leaned heavily against a tree trunk, breathing hard. But I'm no good to you like this. Leave me here, take the horse and— No! The word came out sharp as a whip crack. I'm not leaving you. Maeve, be reasonable. You got a chance if you go now. Alone, they want you alive. Which means they won't shoot to kill. But me. He coughed, and flecks of blood appeared on his lips. I'm just an obstacle to them now. Maeve knelt beside the spring and soaked a piece of cloth in the cold water, using it to clean the worst of the blood from his wounds. Maybe I'm tired of running, she said. Maybe I'm tired of letting other people decide what happens to me. This isn't the time for heroics. Isn't it? She met his eyes, and he saw something there he'd never seen before. Not just courage, but a kind of fierce determination. You said once that I was stronger than what they did to me. Maybe it's time I proved that. Before Elias could respond, they heard it, the sound of horses moving through the trees, still distant but getting closer. Too many horses for it to be the lone survivor returning with a few friends. They're here, Maeve whispered. Through the pre-dawn darkness, they could see torches moving between the trees like angry fireflies. Elias counted at least 6 distinct lights, which meant Beaksley had brought serious force this time. Listen to me, Elias said, gripping Maeve's hand with what strength he had left. They'll want to take you alive, but they'll try to use me to control you. Don't let them— Whatever they threaten to do to me, don't give in. Elias, promise me. His grip tightened. If you surrender because of me, then everything we've done, everything we've fought for, it's all been for nothing. The torches were closer now, and they could hear voices calling back and forth as the searchers spread out through the forest. It wouldn't be long before someone spotted their hiding place. I promise, Maeve said. Though the words tasted like poison, they didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, torchlight flickered through the trees around their small clearing, and armed men emerged from the shadows like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Jonah Beaksley stepped into the circle of light, impeccably dressed despite the early hour and rough terrain. Behind him came 5 men with guns drawn, not local bounty hunters this time, but professionals with the hard faces of career killers. Mr. Gray, Beaksley said with a mock politeness, taking in Elias's condition with satisfaction. You look unwell. Perhaps you should have accepted my generous offer when you had the chance?" Elias tried to stand, but only managed to get to his knees before weakness overwhelmed him. Two of Beaksley's men immediately trained their rifles on him. "And Miss Tucker?" Beaksley's cold gaze shifted to Maeve. "How good to see you again. Though I must say, you've caused me considerable inconvenience." Maeve rose slowly, her hand moving toward the pistol tucked into her belt. "Stay back. Now. Now." Beaksley raised a hand in a gesture of false calm. "There's no need for dramatics. You know why I'm here. You know what I want. I'm not going back to that place. My dear girl, you never left. Oh, you may have absconded with your physical person, but legally speaking, you remain my property until your debt is satisfied." Beaksley's tone was that of a patient teacher explaining simple arithmetic. "The sooner you accept that reality, the easier this will be for everyone." "She's not property," Elias managed to say, though speaking sent fresh pain shooting through his chest. "People aren't property." Beaksley's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Spoken like a true idealist. "Tell me, Mr. Gray, what do you call it when someone owes money they cannot pay? When they've consumed goods and services without compensation? In the civilized world, we call that debt, and debt must be repaid. By marking women like cattle?" Maeve's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "By keeping them locked up like animals? By any means necessary to ensure compliance with lawful contracts?" Beaksley stepped closer, his men spreading out to cut off any escape routes. "You signed papers, Miss Tucker. You agreed to work off your family's obligations. The fact that you found the arrangement unpleasant doesn't invalidate your legal commitment. I never signed anything. Your mother did. Before she died, she signed over your services to cover the medical expenses and funeral costs." Beaksley reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, all perfectly legal and properly witnessed. Maeve stared at the papers in his hand, her face going white. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Your mother was dying, Miss Tucker. The doctor's bills were mounting, and your family had no way to pay. I offered a solution, immediate payment of all expenses in exchange for your service until the debt was cleared." Beaksley's smile was thin and cold. "She was grateful for my generosity. She would do anything to ensure her daughter had a chance at life, even if that life involved unpleasant obligations." Beaksley folded the papers and returned them to his coat. "Maternal love is such a powerful force, don't you think?" Elias watched Maeve's face crumble as the implications hit her. Everything she'd believed about her escape, about her right to freedom, was being twisted into something ugly and legal and binding. "Even if that's true," Elias said, forcing the words out through gritted teeth, "debt doesn't justify what you did to her, what you did to all those women. I provided food, shelter, and purpose to women who would otherwise have starved on the streets." Beaksley's tone remained maddeningly reasonable. "If the work was demanding, well, life itself is demanding. At least they were guaranteed survival. You branded her like livestock. I marked my property to prevent theft, as any reasonable businessman would do." Beaksley's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Speaking of which, you've committed a serious crime. Mr. Gray, theft of valuable property, harboring a fugitive, conspiracy to defraud. These are hanging offenses in some jurisdictions." One of Beaksley's men stepped forward, pressing the barrel of his rifle against Elias's forehead. "Want me to save the territory the cost of a trial, boss?" "Not yet. Samuel, our Miss Tucker needs to understand the consequences of continued resistance." Beaksley looked directly at Maeve. "You see, my dear, every moment you remain in unlawful freedom adds to your debt. Interest compounds daily, and now, thanks to your adventures, you're also responsible for the cost of tracking you down, the expenses of this expedition, and compensation for the men Mr. Gray killed." "How much?" Maeve asked quietly. "I'd estimate your current obligation at approximately $3,000. At the standard rate of debt reduction, that represents, roughly 15 years of service. The number hit like a physical blow. 15 years. By the time she'd worked off the debt, she'd be past 30, used up and broken. Of course, Beaksley continued. I'm prepared to be reasonable. Return voluntarily now. Accept your obligations without further resistance, and I'll reduce the penalty to a mere 10 years. Refuse. He gestured to his men. Well, Mr. Gray's continued existence becomes quite precarious. Maeve looked at Elias, seeing the blood seeping through his bandages, the gray pallor of his skin. He was dying already. She realized, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the wounds were too severe for him to survive without proper medical care. What guarantee do I have? She asked. I beg your pardon? If I come with you, what guarantee do I have that you won't kill him anyway? Beaksley considered this with the air of a man weighing a business proposition. You have my word as a gentleman. Your word isn't worth the paper it's written on. Perhaps not, but it's the only currency I'm prepared to offer. Beaksley pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. You have 1 minute to decide. Miss Tucker, after that. I'll assume you prefer to watch Mr. Gray die slowly rather than accept your lawful obligations. The clearing fell silent except for the sound of Elias's labored breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird greeting the dawn. Maeve looked around at the armed men, at Beaksley's cold, satisfied face, at Elias bleeding his life away onto the forest floor. 15 years, or 10, if she surrendered now. 10 years of degradation and abuse, of being treated like property, of having her humanity stripped away piece by piece. But Elias would live. Maybe, if Beaksley kept his word. Time's up, Beaksley announced. Samuel, if you would. Wait. Maeve's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. I'll come with you. No, Elias whispered, trying to reach for her. Maeve, don't. I'll come with you, she repeated, louder this time. But first, I want to say goodbye. Beaksley nodded graciously. Of course, a moment of sentiment is perfectly understandable. Maeve knelt beside Elias, her hand finding his. To anyone watching, it would look like a tender farewell between lovers. But as she leaned close, her lips near his ear, she whispered something that made his eyes go wide. Trust me, she breathed. When I move, be ready. Before he could respond, she was standing again, her hand resting on the butt of the pistol at her belt. She looked directly at Beaksley, her blue eyes blazing with something between rage and resolution. You want your property back? She said. Come and take it. The gun appeared in her hand like magic, the barrel swinging toward Beaksley's chest. For a split second, everyone in the clearing froze, caught between surprise and training. Then Maeve Tucker, the woman they'd marked as property, the girl they'd tried to break and own and use up, squeezed the trigger. The bullet took Jonah Beaksley high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees among the spring wildflowers. For a heartbeat, the clearing erupted into chaos as his men scrambled for cover, unsure whether to shoot the woman they'd been ordered to take alive. That moment of hesitation was all Elias needed, despite his wounds. He rolled behind the limestone outcropping and came up with his pistol, putting 2 quick shots into the nearest gunman before the others could react. Maeve dove sideways as bullets whined past her head, using the confusion to take cover behind a massive oak tree. She could hear Beaksley cursing and gasping, still alive but badly hurt. Take her alive, he shouted to his men. I want her alive. But his authority was bleeding away with his life, and his hired guns were more concerned with staying breathing than following orders. They spread out through the trees, using the pre-dawn darkness to their advantage as they tried to flank the 2 defenders. Elias counted muzzle flashes, 4 men still standing, maybe 5, too many for a wounded man and a woman with limited ammunition. But they had the advantage of desperation, and sometimes that was enough. Samuel, Beaksley's voice was weaker now, strained with pain. Samuel, finish this! A tall man with a scarred face emerged from behind a cedar tree, rifle raised. This was Samuel. Beaksley's lieutenant, and unlike the others, he moved with the confidence of a professional killer. "Come on out, girl," Samuel called. "Boss wants to talk to you." "I've heard enough of his talk," Maeve replied, checking her remaining ammunition. 3 bullets left in the cylinder. "You killed a lawman. That's a hanging offense, even for a woman." "He wasn't a lawman, just a man with a false badge and a black heart." Samuel laughed, the sound harsh in the morning air. "Law's whatever the man with the most guns says it is, and right now, that's us." A shot rang out from their left flank, the bullet splintering bark inches from Maeve's head. Another gunman was trying to work his way around behind them. She fired back, heard a curse, but couldn't tell if she'd hit anything vital. Elias was fading fast. She could see him slumped against the rocks, his breathing shallow and irregular. Blood had soaked through all his bandages, and his face was the color of old parchment. "Elias," she whispered, "stay with me." His eyes flickered open, unfocused but determined. "How many left?" "Too many." He managed a weak smile. "Then we better make our shots count." Another bullet cracked past them, this one from their right. They were being surrounded systematically, pushed back toward the spring where there would be no cover at all. "This is your last chance, girl," Samuel shouted. "Come out now, and maybe we'll make your friend's death quick." Maeve looked at Elias, saw him trying to raise his pistol with trembling hands. He was done, finished, running on nothing but stubborn will. In minutes, maybe seconds, they'd be overrun. But then she heard something that made her heart leap, the sound of horses approaching fast through the forest, not the careful advance of hunters, but the thundering charge of riders in a hurry. "What the hell?" Samuel's voice was cut off by the crack of rifle fire, but not from his men. These shots came from the forest beyond, and they were aimed at Beaksley's gunmen. Through the trees came 6 riders, their face grim and determined. At their head rode a man Maeve recognized from Bandera, Samuel Cross, the rancher who'd seemed sympathetic to Beaksley's cause. But these men weren't riding to help the false sheriff. They were riding to end him. "That's far enough! Beaksley!" Cross shouted as his men spread out, surrounding the clearing. "This stops now." Beaksley, still on his knees and bleeding heavily, looked up in confusion. "Cross, what are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mistake," Cross replied, dismounting with his rifle ready. "Should have done this when you first came to town with your lies and false papers." "I don't understand. You thought we were stupid enough to believe your story about legal debt and proper contracts?" Cross spat in the dirt. "We may be country folk, Beaksley, but we're not blind. Word came through from Austin yesterday. You're wanted for trafficking, fraud, and about a dozen other crimes." Samuel, seeing the odds shift dramatically against them, made a desperate play. He swung his rifle toward Maeve, but Cross was faster. The rancher's shot took Samuel center mass, dropping him before he could squeeze the trigger. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader down and surrounded by hostile forces, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. Cross walked over to where Beaksley knelt bleeding among the wildflowers. The false sheriff's face was gray with shock and blood loss, but his eyes still burned with malicious fury. "You have no idea what you're doing," Beaksley gasped. "I have powerful friends, important connections. This won't end here." "Maybe not," Cross said calmly. "But your part in it will." He looked over at Maeve and Elias, taking in their condition with a practiced eye. "Ma'am, your man needs a doctor. My boy Jacob's got medical training from the war. He can patch him up enough for the ride to town." Maeve nodded gratefully, too overwhelmed to speak. One of Cross's men, a young fellow with gentle hands, was already kneeling beside Elias with a medical kit. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why did you help us?" Cross removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Because we heard what really happened at that place Beaksley was running. Heard about the women he kept there. What he did to them." His voice hardened. "Some lines you don't cross, not if you want to call yourself a man." as Jacob worked on Elias's wounds, cleaning and rebandaging them with proper supplies. Cross knelt beside Beaksley. The false sheriff was still alive. But barely. "Those papers you showed us," Cross said. "The ones claiming this girl owed you money. Where are they?" Beaksley's hand moved weakly toward his coat pocket. Cross reached in and pulled out the folded documents, examining them in the growing daylight. "Forgeries," he announced. "Pretty good ones, but forgeries all the same. Girl's mother never signed anything." He looked at Maeve. "You're free, miss, legally and properly free." The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. Free, after all the running, all the fear, all the nights wondering if she'd ever truly escape. She was finally, actually free. Beaksley tried to speak, blood frothing on his lips. You don't understand. There are others, more places." "Then we'll find them too," Cross said grimly. "And we'll shut them down, one by one." By the time Jacob finished with Elias, the sun was fully up, painting the clearing in golden light. The wounded man was conscious and coherent, though still weak from blood loss. "Will he live?" Maeve asked. "If we get him to town and keep those wounds clean," Jacob replied. "He's tough as old leather. I'll give him that." They made a stretcher from blankets and tree branches, carefully loading Elias for the journey back to Bandera. As they prepared to leave, Cross approached Maeve with something in his hand. "Found this in Beaksley's saddlebags," he said, holding out a small leather pouch. "Gold coin and paper money. Figure it's compensation for what you've been through." Maeve stared at the pouch, then at Beaksley's still form lying among the flowers. The man who'd claimed to own her, who'd marked her like livestock, who'd tried to steal her very humanity. He was finished, dead or dying. It didn't matter. His power over her was broken forever. "What will you do now?" Cross asked as they mounted up for the ride to town. Maeve looked at Elias, strapped to the makeshift stretcher but alive, his eyes clear and focused on her face. Then she looked around at the men who'd risked their lives to help strangers, who'd stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. "Live," she said simply. "We're going to live." The journey back to Bandera took most of the morning, with frequent stops to check on Elias and adjust his bandages. By the time they reached town, word had already spread about the confrontation in the forest. People lined the main street, watching in silence as the procession passed. Mrs. Henderson from the general store stepped forward as they stopped in front of the doctor's office. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "Some of that blue cloth," Maeve said. "I think I'd like to make myself a proper dress." The older woman smiled. "I'll have it ready for you. Dear, no charge." As Cross's men carried Elias into the doctor's office, Maeve paused at the threshold. Behind her lay everything she'd run from: the fear, the shame, the sense of being marked and owned. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. She looked down at her hands, still stained with gunpowder from the shot that had ended Beaksley's reign of terror. These were the hands that had killed a man, that had chosen violence to preserve freedom. She should have felt guilty, maybe, or ashamed. Instead, she felt strong, for the first time since they'd branded her thigh with that terrible word. Maeve Tucker felt like she truly owned herself. And that, she thought as she followed Elias into the doctor's office, was worth whatever came next. 6 weeks later, the wildflowers were in full bloom across the Texas Hill Country. Bluebonnets carpeted the meadows like pieces of fallen sky, while Indian paintbrush added splashes of red among the limestone outcroppings. The air smelled of cedar and new grass, and the morning light held the golden promise of summer to come. Elias stood in the doorway of their rebuilt cabin, watching Maeve tend the vegetable garden they'd planted together. His shoulder still ached when the weather changed, and he moved more carefully than before. But he was whole. The doctor in Bandera had done good work, and time had done the rest. "Tomatoes are coming along fine," Maeve called, brushing dirt from her hands. She wore the blue dress she'd sewn from Mrs. Henderson's cloth, and her auburn hair caught the sunlight like spun copper. Should have fresh ones by July. Good. Elias stepped out onto the porch, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Been thinking about that trip to San Antonio we talked about, maybe August, when the heat breaks. They'd been making plans, small ones at first, then bigger as the fear gradually faded. A trip to the city, maybe a proper wedding ceremony in a real church, perhaps even a journey back east to see what remained of his family's farm in Virginia. The future had opened up before them like a door they'd thought was permanently locked. "Got something for you," Elias said, reaching into his pocket. Maeve looked up from the garden, dirt smudged on her cheek and curiosity in her blue eyes. "What kind of something?" Instead of answering, Elias pulled out what he'd been working on for the past month, a ring hammered from the brass of his last remaining bullet cartridge from the war. It wasn't pretty by conventional standards, the metal still bearing the marks of his amateur smithing, but it caught the morning light and held it like a promise. "Elias Gray," Maeve said softly, understanding immediately what this meant. "Maeve Tucker," he replied, dropping to one knee right there in the garden dirt. "I know I'm not much of a catch, war-damaged, poor as a church mouse, and probably too stubborn for my own good, but I love you more than I ever thought possible to love anybody." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she was smiling, really smiling, the kind of expression that transformed her entire face. "I made this from the last bullet I carried home from the war," Elias continued, holding up the crude ring. "Figured if I was going to keep it, ought to turn it into something that creates life instead of taking it away." Maeve knelt in the garden soil beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the ring. "It's beautiful." "It's rough work. Probably turn your finger green." "I don't care." She looked into his eyes, seeing past the scars and the careful way he held himself, seeing the man who'd risked everything to give her back her freedom. "Yes, yes, yes, I'll marry you, you stubborn fool." She laughed through her tears. "Though I should warn you, I come with considerable baggage." Elias slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how right it looked there despite its imperfections. "We all got baggage, darling. Question is whether we're strong enough to carry it together." They stayed there in the garden for a long time, holding each other while the sun climbed higher and the mockingbirds sang their complex songs in the live oak trees. When they finally stood, brushing dirt from their clothes, both of them were grinning like children who discovered a secret treasure. "When?" Maeve asked. "Soon as we can arrange it proper. Been thinking about the little church over in Comfort, the one with the bell tower and the whitewashed walls." "I'd like that." Maeve turned the ring on her finger, watching how it caught the light. "Think folks will come?" "Mrs. Henderson will. The Cross family for sure. Doc Matthews said he'd be honored to stand witness." Elias paused, thinking of all the people in Bandera who'd quietly supported them after the truth about Beaksley came out. "More than you might expect, I think." Over the following weeks, they made their preparations. Maeve sewed a proper wedding dress from white cotton, simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons, Mrs. Henderson had saved from her own grandmother's gown. Elias cleaned up his best suit and bought new boots that didn't have bullet holes in them. Samuel Cross offered to host the reception at his ranch, and his wife Martha took charge of organizing the food. Word spread quietly through the hill country, and people began offering help. Flowers from this garden, music from that fiddle player, a cake from the preacher's wife who was known for her baking. It wasn't a grand affair by city standards, but it was theirs. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that kept the heat bearable. The little church in Comfort sat on a hill overlooking the Guadalupe River, its white walls gleaming in the sunlight and its brass bell ringing out across the valley. Maeve stood in the church's small anteroom, adjusting her dress one final time. Martha Cross had helped with her hair, pinning it up with tiny wildflowers, and Mrs. Henderson had lent her a cameo brooch that had belonged to 3 generations of women in her family. "You look beautiful, dear," Martha said, stepping back to admire her work. Through the doorway, Maeve could see the church filling with people, more than she'd expected. Faces both familiar and new. Some she recognized from Bandera. Others must have traveled from neighboring towns, all of them here to witness something that had seemed impossible just months ago. "Nervous?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "No," Maeve said, and realized she meant it. "Ready." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Reverend William Hayes, a gentle man with silver hair and kind eyes, spoke about love as a choice rather than just a feeling, about the courage it took to build something beautiful from the wreckage of broken dreams. When it came time for vows, Elias spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "Maeve, I promise to stand with you against whatever comes. I promise to see you as you are, not as what others tried to make you. I promise to love the strength that kept you alive and the gentleness that makes you who you are." Maeve's voice was steady when she responded, though tears tracked down her cheeks. "Elias, I promise to build a life with you based on choice, not fear. I promise to trust in the future we're making together. I promise to love you not despite the scars we carry, but including them, because they're part of what brought us to each other." When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, the little church erupted in applause and cheers, as they kissed for the first time as married couple. Maeve felt something she'd never expected to experience, the simple joy of being celebrated rather than hidden. The reception at the Cross Ranch was a joyous affair. Someone had strung lanterns between the oak trees, and a small band played fiddle music that had folks dancing despite the heat. Children ran between the tables while their parents shared stories and laughter. As the evening wore on and the stars began to appear, Elias and Maeve found themselves sitting together on the ranch house porch, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate. "No regrets?" Elias asked, taking her hand and running his thumb over the brass ring. "About what?" "Any of it. The fighting, the killing, the choice to stay instead of run." Maeve considered this seriously. 6 months ago, she would have said that violence was never the answer, that there had to be better ways to solve problems. But 6 months ago, she'd been a different person, someone who still believed that if you kept your head down and endured long enough, the world would eventually show mercy. "No regrets," she said finally. "We did what we had to do to be free, both of us. Think Beaksley's people will leave us be? I think they got bigger problems now." She squeezed his hand. "Cross said the Rangers shut down 3 more of those places in the past month. Arrested a dozen men for trafficking and fraud. Whatever organization Beaksley had, it's falling apart." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the music and laughter from the party. Tomorrow they'd go back to their cabin in the hills, back to the quiet life they were building together. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but they'd face them as partners. "Elias," Maeve said as the evening wound down. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me, really seeing me, not just the damaged parts." She turned to look at him, her face serious in the lantern light. "For helping me remember that I'm not what was done to me." "You never were," he said. "You were always just Maeve Tucker, strong, stubborn, beautiful Maeve Tucker. Maeve Gray now," she corrected with a smile. "Maeve Gray," he agreed. "Has a nice ring to it." As they prepared to leave the party, Samuel Cross pulled Elias aside. "Got something for you," the rancher said, handing him an envelope. Wedding present. Inside was a deed to 40 acres of good land adjoining their current homestead, signed over free and clear. "Sam, I can't accept this." "Sure you can. Figure a man who's willing to stand up to the likes of Beaksley deserves a proper place to raise a family." Cross grinned. "Besides, you'll be good neighbors. Could use more folks like you two in these parts." The ride home under the star-filled sky was quiet and peaceful. Maeve rode behind Elias on their horse, her arms wrapped around his waist, her head resting against his back. The brass ring on her finger gleamed in the moonlight. Not perfect, but real and solid and theirs. When they reached their cabin, Elias carried her across the threshold despite her laughing protests about his still-healing shoulder. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. Simple, clean, and filled with the quiet promise of shared tomorrows. "So," Maeve said, as they stood together in their small home, "what do we do now?" Elias looked around at the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love, at the woman who'd chosen to fight for her freedom and then chosen to share it with him. "Now," he said, pulling her close, We live free, and we live together, and we never let anybody make us into something we're not." Outside, the Texas night settled around their cabin like a protective blanket, full of promise and possibility. And inside, two people who'd fought their way back from the edge of despair began the simple, revolutionary act of building a life based on love instead of fear. The war was over. The running was over. The real life, their life, was just beginning. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 4.